I first heard about Rebecca Moore from a colleague who mentioned a story that sounded too bizarre to be true. A DNA test that reunited two strangers, revealed they'd been swapped at birth, and then destroyed both families financially. I was skeptical. I investigated. What I found was more complex and heartbreaking than any headline could capture. Rebecca opened her 23andMe results on a Saturday morning in March 2019. She told me later that she'd expected confirmation of what her mother had always said. Irish, some German, maybe a surprise Scandinavian ancestor from Minnesota settlement patterns. Instead, the platform showed her something she'd never seen in promotional materials. A notification. A new DNA relative. Jessica. Predicted relationship. First cousin. 12.5% shared DNA. Would she like to connect? She clicked yes. Jessica clicked yes. They arranged coffee for the following weekend, a neutral Starbucks in Davenport, Iowa, halfway between their homes. They brought photo albums. They shared childhood stories. They discovered they'd been born 3 days apart in July 1989, at the same hospital, to mothers who'd never met but who'd occupied adjacent beds in the maternity ward. By the end of that first meeting, they knew they weren't cousins. They were sisters. But not in any way they'd imagined. They were sisters because they'd been exchanged. Rebecca had been born to Diane. Jessica had been born to Angela. A nurse had placed each infant with the wrong mother. I tracked down both women, and spent months piecing together what happened next. The reunion made national news. Good Morning America. People magazine. A documentary deal that fell through when the story became too complicated, too messy, too lacking in the clean resolution that true crime audiences expect. The aftermath made both families file for bankruptcy within 18 months. This is the story I uncovered. How genetic truth, when it collides with legal and financial systems designed for biological fiction, destroys the very families it reveals. Rebecca Moore grew up in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, with parents who told her she was adopted from the start. Your birth mother loved you enough to give you a better life, her mother Margaret would say. The story was simple, virtuous, complete. Teenage mother. Closed adoption. Grateful adoptive parents who couldn't conceive. Rebecca's childhood was stable, middle class, unremarkable in the best ways. Her father Thomas was an accountant. Her mother taught elementary school. They took vacations to Wisconsin Dells. They attended Methodist church. Rebecca was an average student, a good swimmer, a child who accepted her adoption narrative without much questioning because it was never presented as a mystery to solve. She knew her birth mother's name, Angela Russo, because Iowa's adoption records were semi-open. She could have requested contact after age 18. She never did. I have parents, she told friends who asked. Why complicate that? Jessica Park grew up in Des Moines 2 hours south with a different story. Her mother Diane told her that her father was a brief affair, a mistake, someone who didn't want to be involved. Diane never named him. Jessica assumed he was married, or dangerous, or simply uninterested. She didn't press. Diane was a high school teacher, strict but loving, who'd raised Jessica alone with fierce independence. Jessica's childhood was also stable, also middle class, also unremarkable. She was a better student than Rebecca, valedictorian of her high school class, full scholarship to University of Iowa. She became a physical therapist, married an orthodontist, had 2 children. She thought about her biological father sometimes, but Diane's pain when the subject arose discouraged investigation. The women were 30 years old when 23andMe matched them. Rebecca had bought the kit on Black Friday, curious about ethnicity percentages. Jessica had received hers as a Mother's Day gift from her husband, who thought genealogy was a fun hobby for someone interested in family. Their matching segments were on chromosomes 3, 7, 12, and 15, consistent with first cousins, but also consistent with half-siblings who shared one parent. The platform's algorithm couldn't distinguish between these relationships with certainty. The women would have to do that themselves. They met at 10 a.m. on a Saturday, both arriving exactly on time. Rebecca from Cedar Rapids, Jessica from Des Moines, each having driven 2 hours to a neutral location. Rebecca wore a blue sweater. Jessica wore a blue scarf. They laughed about the coincidence, the first of many. Rebecca brought her adoption paperwork. Jessica brought her birth certificate. They spread documents on the table like puzzle pieces. Two women who'd spent 30 years as strangers now searching for connection in official forms. Rebecca's birth certificate. July 14, 1989, 7:23 a.m., St. Mary's Hospital, Cedar Rapids. Birth weight, 7 pounds 3 ounces. Mother, Angela Russo, age 19. Father, listed as unknown. Jessica's birth certificate. July 17, 1989, 6:47 a.m., St. Mary's Hospital, Cedar Rapids. Birth weight, 7 pounds 3 ounces. Mother, Diane Park, age 32. Father, listed as unknown. Same hospital. Same birth weight. 3 days apart. Their mothers had been in the maternity ward simultaneously. Rebecca pulled up her phone, showing Jessica the only photo she had of Angela Russo, a young woman with dark hair, tired eyes, holding a newborn with visible ambivalence. Jessica stared at it, then pulled out her own phone, showing a photo of Diane from 1989, also in a hospital gown, also holding a newborn. They were roommates, Jessica said slowly. Or near roommates. My mom mentioned once that she shared a room with a young girl who seemed overwhelmed. She never got the girl's name. The DNA match suddenly made terrible sense. They weren't cousins. They were sisters, but not in the way either had imagined. They were sisters because they'd been exchanged. Rebecca had been born to Diane. Jessica had been born to Angela. The nurse who'd handled their births had placed each infant with the wrong mother. I dug into the history of St. Mary's Hospital in 1989. They employed a nurse named Helen Crawford, 62 years old, 40 years of maternity ward experience, known for her efficiency and her old-fashioned beliefs about family. She'd started nursing in 1952, when unwed mothers were routinely separated from their infants, when rehabilitation meant giving babies to married couples, when the nursery was a place of judgment as much as care. Helen's journals, discovered in 2018 by a cleaning crew clearing her house after her death, revealed a pattern. Between 1984 and 1992, she systematically swapped infants she deemed mismatched with their mothers. Her criteria: age, marital status, moral character as she interpreted it from brief interactions. Angela Russo, 19 and unmarried. Didn't deserve a healthy baby in Helen's assessment. Diane Park, 32 and married but too old to be starting over, was wasting her last chance at proper motherhood. Helen believed she was correcting God's mistakes, placing infants with mothers who matched their needs. She swapped Rebecca and Jessica on July 17, 1989, Jessica's actual birthday, 3 days after Rebecca's birth. Both infants had jaundice, requiring phototherapy in the nursery. Both were away from their mothers for extended periods. Helen had opportunity, access and conviction. The journals revealed 6 other swaps. 1984, 1986, 1987, 1988, 1990, 1991. 7 infants total placed with wrong families, their biological parents never knowing. Helen died in 2004, never charged. Her crimes discovered only when her house was cleared 14 years later. Rebecca and Jessica, realizing the scope of their situation, made a decision. They would find their biological mothers. They would tell them the truth. They would seek justice, understanding, some form of resolution for the 30 years of misdirected love. The meetings were devastating. Diane Park, Jessica's biological mother, had raised Rebecca believing she was her adopted daughter. Learning that Rebecca was actually her biological child, that she'd nursed her, loved her, raised her, without knowing they were genetically connected, broke something in her. I knew, she kept saying. I knew you were mine. I always knew. Angela Russo, Rebecca's biological mother, had spent 30 years wondering about the daughter she'd given up. Learning that Jessica, the child she'd raised, the child she thought was hers, was actually Diane's biological daughter, while Rebecca, the stranger with her eyes, was her own, created a grief without name. She'd loved the wrong child. She'd missed the right one. Both families, reeling, turned to the same resource, the internet. Rebecca's sister, her raised sister, her non-biological sister, the complexity already straining language, started a GoFundMe. Help our family navigate medical verification and therapy after DNA discovery. Jessica's husband started another. Support for two families destroyed by hospital negligence. The campaigns went viral. The story, swapped at birth, reunited by DNA, the villainous nurse dead before justice, had narrative perfection. Rebecca and Jessica appeared on local news, then regional, then national. The Today Show segment brought in $200,000 in donations in 48 hours. Total raised $400,000 between both families. They spent it. Genetic testing for all family members to confirm relationships. Therapy for 6 adults and 4 children suddenly grappling with redefined family structures. A joint bonding vacation to Hawaii, suggested by a therapist as neutral territory for building new relationships. Legal retainers for the lawsuits they were planning against St. Mary's Hospital and Helen Crawford's estate. They didn't think about taxes. The money was donations, gifts, support from sympathetic strangers. They were victims of a crime, receiving charity. Taxable income was for earnings, for work, for business. This was compassion. This was community. This was different. The IRS contacted both families in March 2021. The letters began. Your 2019 tax return has been selected for examination. The examination revealed $400,000 in unreported income. GoFundMe donations, the IRS determined, were taxable gifts when they exceeded the annual exclusion amount, and when they were used for personal expenses rather than charitable purposes. The tax bills were devastating. Rebecca's family, $89,000 in back taxes, penalties, and interest. Jessica's family, $112,000, higher because their campaign had raised more, and because Jessica's husband had an orthodontics practice that put them in a higher tax bracket. They'd spent the money. The genetic testing was done. The therapy was ongoing. The Hawaii vacation was memories and photographs. The legal retainers were depleted. The lawsuits against St. Mary's stalled in procedural delays. The estate of Helen Crawford containing only $23,000 in assets, barely enough to cover her final medical bills. Payment plans failed. The IRS placed liens on both families' homes. Rebecca's mother Margaret, the woman who'd raised her, who was now legally nothing to her biologically but everything emotionally, lost the house she'd lived in for 40 years. Jessica's father, the orthodontist who'd raised her, had his retirement accounts garnished, his practice's cash flow interrupted. The lawsuit settled in 2023. St. Mary's Hospital, admitting no liability but seeking closure, paid $75,000 per family. After attorney fees, $41,000 each. Not enough to cover the tax debt. Not enough to restore the homes. Not enough to compensate for the therapy that would now be unaffordable. I spoke with Rebecca and Jessica separately last month. They no longer speak to each other. The pressure of shared trauma, of being constant reminders to each other of what was lost and what was gained, became unbearable after the bankruptcy filings. Rebecca moved to Seattle, changed her name professionally, works remotely as a marketing consultant. She sees her biological mother Angela monthly, trying to build the relationship they were denied, finding it awkward and painful and occasionally wonderful. She doesn't speak to Diane, the woman who raised her, who she now understands was also a victim but who represents the life that was stolen. Jessica stayed in Des Moines, divorced, shares custody of 2 children who are biologically her nephews by the swap logic, Diane's grandchildren. Not hers, except she raised them, except they call her mom, except genetics says they're not related to her at all. She's dating again, she told me, but explaining her family situation requires a flowchart. Helen Crawford's other swaps, 6 other families potentially, have never been identified. The hospital destroyed many records. The infants are adults now, possibly unaware, possibly suspecting something from 23andMe matches they don't understand. The system that created this damage has no mechanism for repairing it. I think about Rebecca and Jessica often. They wanted to know where they came from. They found out they came from a crime, a confusion, a well-intentioned evil that outlasted its perpetrator. They found each other, then lost everything else. DNA tests don't just reveal ancestry. They reveal infrastructure, medical systems, legal systems, tax systems that wasn't built for genetic surprises. Before you spit in that tube, ask yourself, are you ready for the story it might tell, and the bills that come with it? I document these stories because someone has to. Subscribe for more.